When the bombers of the German Luftwaffe flew against the British Isles in 1940 to launch the Battle of Britain, the coast of England was studded with a series of tall wooden towers which had been erected some 2 years before. Within shelters associated with these towers, military personnel intently watched the glowing faces of cathode ray tubes and communicated with interceptor control points and anti-aircraft batteries. As the attacking planes approached the British coast, fighters took off to meet them, and anti-aircraft crews manned their guns. The German squadrons found the British forces alert and ready, and in the following months of the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe was decisively beaten back. Never, said Winston Churchill, had so many owed so much to so few. Never, he might perhaps have added, could so few have repulsed the fury of the German assault had it not been for those wooden towers and those glowing tubes. For this was radio location, as the English called it, in its first spectacular operational test. Radio location, which robbed the attackers of the great military advantage of surprise and allowed efficient centralized control of the defensive forces, contributing mightily to the British victory. But although this was radio location's first great challenge and triumph, the basic theory of its operation had long been known. During the 1930s, scientists in the United States, France, and Germany, as well as Britain, had independently developed workable systems. In this country, much of the early research and development was done at the Army's Fort Monmouth Signal Corps laboratories, and during this period, many important achievements were recorded by a small group of dedicated men. Concurrently, significant discoveries in this field were made by scientists of the Naval Research Laboratory. In 1938, the SCR-268 was initially tested by the Coast Artillery. Desired at first as an aid in the aiming of searchlights, it was soon applied to the directing of anti-aircraft guns as well. In 1939, the longer-ranged SCR-270 and 271 were developed by Fort Monmouth for the Army Air Corps as early warning sets. The United States called these systems radar, for radio detection and ranging, a term that is now universally accepted. Our early sets utilized the longer waves of the radar spectrum, requiring large, cumbersome antennas for even short-range operations. In 1940, British scientists came to America with the newly developed magnetron tube, which could produce high-power pulses of short-wave energy, permitting antennas of more manageable size and a higher degree of accuracy. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the U.S. set up a radar research unit to supplement the Army and Navy laboratories. Britain and America pooled their radar efforts, and with that collaboration began the history of modern radar. Radar works because radio energy transmitted outward from an antenna will be reflected or echoed back by obstacles encountered in its path. By means of a directional antenna array, the radiated energy can be focused into a narrow beam or lobe, making it possible to determine the direction or azimuth of any target seen by the radar. If the energy is radiated in separate pulses, the time it takes a pulse to reach the target and its echo to return indicates target distance or range. Search, target acquisition, and surveillance radars scan the sky or surface in various patterns to keep broad areas under observation. Tracking radar is designed to keep one target continuously centered in its beam. Some radars can be used for either search or tracking purposes, and a recently developed system called Track While Scan allows the tracking of targets which are being observed by search radar. Continuous wave, or CW radar, employs separate sending and receiving antennas and is not a pulse signal. It is chiefly used to measure target speed, a radar capability which results from the Doppler effect. Because of this Doppler effect, the reflection from a target moving toward the antenna will be of shorter wavelength or higher frequency than the transmitted signal. The return from a target moving away from the antenna will be of greater wavelength or lower frequency than the transmitted signal. By comparing the transmitted and return frequencies, the speed of the target can be computed and moving targets discriminated from stationary ones. This shows the Doppler shift principle applied to CW radar. Pulse radar can also take advantage of the Doppler effect to observe moving targets and measure their speed. This moving truck will reflect a signal pulse of a different frequency than the transmitted pulse. Some pulse Doppler radars measure the frequency shift occurring within the echo alone, without reference to the transmitted signal. In this instance, reflections from terrain obstacles, the moving truck, and the faster moving wheels will all be of different frequencies, depicted here by the thickness of the waves. By measuring these differences in frequency, the radar can detect the moving target, gauge its speed, and even in some cases, recognize its nature because of the characteristic way it changes the return frequencies. Frequency modulated, or FM radar, varies the frequency of a continuously transmitted signal in a fixed pattern. Target distance can be computed by relating this pattern to the amount of modulation appearing in the reflected echo. Radar indicators display target information in various ways. The A-scan indicator displays the single dimension of range, resulting from the time difference between the pulse indication, or main bang, on the left and the target reflection pip on the right. This range line becomes a circle in the J-scope with target distance measured along the circumference. The B-scope displays two-dimensional information. Here, azimuth is indicated to left and right of the center line, and range increases vertically from the baseline. The PPI scan, or plan position indicator, plots range as distance from the center of the circle and azimuth as degrees of the circle. There are other scans for other purposes, and to obtain three-dimensional information, indicators are often used in combination. The basic components of a typical radar set are a synchronizer timer, transmitter, antenna system, receiver, indicator, and power supply. The timer, or synchronizer, which is the heart of the radar set, synchronizes the system in the dimension of time, so critical to radar measurements. The transmitter supplies the radio frequency signal to the antenna, and in pulse radar, the spillover from this signal appears as the main pulse on the indicator. The antenna system radiates the signal, picks up the target reflection, and delivers it to the receiver. The receiver amplifies the weak reflection many millions of times and relays it in proper form to the indicator. The power supply services each component. There are additional electronic circuits and servo systems for controlling antenna movement. When the Japanese brought World War II to America by their attack on Pearl Harbor, an SCR-270 radar set gave the warning. A warning, however, that went tragically unheeded by military forces not yet accustomed to undeclared war. During the embattled years of the Great War that followed, the radar art was advanced by leaps and bounds as American and British groups, always far ahead of the Axis powers, developed radar applications of great scope and variety, which assisted in gaining ultimate victory. At first, radar was largely used for air warning systems and anti-aircraft fire direction. If radar could detect enemy planes, it was obvious that friendly interceptors would also appear on the scope and could be led by radio to their targets. Thus, ground-controlled interception was devised. The development of IFF equipment for identification friend or foe allowed radar operators to challenge their targets electronically and from the reply on the radar scope to differentiate between friend and enemy. Airborne radar for fire control came into being, first only as a range indicator to aid pilots in daytime gunnery or to warn them of rear attacks by the enemy. Then in more sophisticated versions, as in this tail gun installation on the B-29. And finally, in the Black Widow night fighter, the radar became the eyes of the pilot, leading him to the enemy plane and indicating when it was time to fire and break off the engagement. One of the most versatile and accurate of World War II radars was the Signal Corps' SCR-584. With both search and tracking capabilities, the SCR-584 could establish target azimuth or elevation angles within an error range of 1/20th of a degree and a distance within 25 yards at maximum range. This microwave set used a parabolic reflector of high gain or focusing power. Many SCR-584s are still in service today. Some U.S. anti-aircraft batteries equipped with the SCR-584 averaged an enemy craft down for every 40 rounds of ammunition expended. The SCR-584 was also used for longer-range search missions. Fighter bombers in tactical sorties over Europe after the invasion were tracked in poor weather by SCR-584s and radio-guided to their targets. Radar was applied to other bombing techniques by the British and Americans. For night raids over the Ruhr Valley, British Pathfinder planes were equipped with radar beacons, which amplified radar reflections for easier tracking. 2 ground radars in England, tracking the Pathfinder, could lead it to the target city where signal flares were dropped to guide the following bomber fleets. In the American shore-end system, the radar was carried aloft and the plane's position determined by the aid of radar beacons on the ground. The accuracy of this system was demonstrated when, by its use, our bombers discovered an error in the map position of the island of Corsica. With America's so-called Mickey radar, the ground echoes were utilized to map the terrain below as a basis for pilotage and blind bombing through clouds or overcast. Of the 400,000 tons of bombs dropped by the 8th Air Force after 1943, more than 1/2 were radar aimed. A sector view shows the radar picture of the ground passing beneath the plane during a bombing mission. In the Pacific, some 110,000 tons of Japanese shipping were sunk in 1 month by the 14th Air Force bombers, all at night and all by the aid of radar. The U.S. Navy also developed radar techniques for target search and fire control against air and surface targets. In many cases, enemy vessels were sunk without being sighted, except as targets on the ship's radar. Other naval radar uses included convoy control, search and rescue operations, and harbor security. Applying radar techniques to the anti-submarine campaign in the Atlantic aided substantially in achieving the 1943 mark of about one sinking a day, with most sightings made by radar. Other radar applications under early development during World War II included aerial navigational aids, weather mapping, radar altimeters, and air traffic control. When in the last months of the conflict, British radar stations began picking up fleeting echoes from the German V-2 ballistic missiles, the problems that would face future radar development were foreshadowed.